Actually, this is a question I have to you. I mean, I've been really surprised by how willing people are to come and be a guest on a podcast. There is maybe the slight caveat that I've mainly asked people I know so far, but even so far, the people I've asked who I don't know have pretty much all said yes within. I write an email a day later that say, "Sure, this sounds great." Is this something that you've also experienced, or I mean, because it seems to me also you're asking like the almost household names within academia, whilst I'm asking like the people whose work I know, whose papers I've read, like irrespective of how famous they are in that sense. So I've always been curious, like whether you have to like write 20 emails to get one yes, or how that works out.
Yeah, I've actually also been surprised by the high hit rate. I'd say my sort of yes ratio is about 50%. So obviously a lot of these people that I'm trying to get on are pretty busy and they get lots of offers to do stuff. So definitely a lot of them have, valid reasons for not doing it. But yeah, mine's around 50%, I'd say. And definitely, I think part of it is the nature of podcasting. So, people like to have conversations and it's not very much effort for them to come on here and do it. There's not a lot of prep. And I think that is something appealing about that. So it's a relatively high and enjoyable payoff for something that doesn't have a lot of effort involved. And then the other thing is that I think that there's a combination of something about the nature of my show where it's a little bit more personal, and that's not always a question or a sort of program of questions that academics are always going to get asked. And also, I just have my my cold email dialed in. I have a really great cold
Okay.
email that I hit people with.
Okay. So there was asked two questions related to that. The first one is, so you said you ask more personal questions. Is that something that you think makes people more or less likely wanting to come onto the show?
It's a mixed bag because I think it's, academics are always going to get asked about, oh, so you are famous for answering this question. Tell me about your answer to this question, right? That's the thing that someone's always going to ask them. But then if you come at them and say, well, I see you're famous for answering this question. How did you get interested in that question in the first place? That's something that very few people are going to ask them. And so to me, I think a lot of people are drawn to being able to talk about that and, just being able to talk about themselves because to some extent, most people like to do that a lot. And, but then also I think that I've gotten a few responses explicitly because they don't want to talk about themselves, but that's much rarer. That's much rarer. And it was
So
also
like someone said, like, yeah, I'd love to talk about my personal life. Or
yeah, I mean, I literally had one person who was like, I won't disclose their name, but they were a very famous
okay.
psychologist who I look up to a lot, and they were like, well, the podcast sounds great, and I wish you the best luck, but I won't do it because I don't believe it's worthwhile to talk about myself versus because I think the work should be front and center. And to be honest, I was super impressed by that. I thought that was super badass.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, I guess to some extent, maybe that is a slight overlap then between what I'm trying to do and what you are doing. Like, I'm not that interested in the personal things per se, but I am interested in kind of the stuff that didn't make it into the paper often.
yeah.
So like that, for example, that question is something I'm also really interested in. And that was, for example, really interesting when I talked to Aaron about this, because it was like you had this whole discussion in the field and his just came completely out of nowhere, it seemed to me, like a completely new approach to the whole thing. So I asked him how did that come about? And he said well, I was just trying to basically reverse engineer it and to think how could I make this? And then I simulated it and then suddenly there it was. And that, so I am also really interested in this kind of how did people...
I think that's a really interesting point about academic papers, which in one sense, they're an extremely efficient means of communicating information, which is that exactly what's going to be said in what order. And so you can really get a complicated thing into your mind from in a relatively short period of time. However, they're extremely inefficient in another sense, because they're so rigid. There's all the stuff that's just not sort of standard stuff to put in there that gets left out, which might in fact be really interesting. And so
I
there
agree.
needs to be another format for exploring those things. Plus, they're also boring as hell for the most part. Whereas podcasts as a form tend to be way more engaging, just based on the number of people that listen to podcasts versus read academic papers.
Yes.
And so I think that discussing these sort of things is a welcome addition to the official documents that represent the results.
Yeah, exactly. I especially agree with what you said about edition here, because I think, I actually read a lot of papers, and despite you saying they're all very boring, I kind of enjoy quite a lot.
Well, that's why you're getting your PhD, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But I think there's just so much that, also, as I said, like, it's an efficient format, so it wouldn't really make sense to put in all this other stuff if basically, like, a paper that has a specific purpose, and hopefully podcasts or other media can provide a different kind of purpose. Wait, now I forgot the second point.
Cold emails.
Oh, your cold email, exactly. Yeah. This is actually kind of interesting, because I realized after you responded to my request, I realized I'd kind of forgotten almost to describe the podcast. It seemed to me. I have to admit, even though we had like no contact prior to that email, somehow I just assumed you were going to say yes, just because we're like both doing podcasts,
like, that guy,
and doing it
Yeah,
just like because of the shared, like, we're doing a PhD, and it seems like, I don't know exactly what you're doing, and maybe we'll get to that, like, but vaguely social neuroscience or something like that. Both interested in writing a podcasting, and somehow they're like, yeah, he's definitely going to say yes. And then I almost didn't explain what I'm trying to do.
No, I was a shoo-in the whole time. So you were correct in that assumption. But the thing that I've been surprised about, so you were mentioning how you've talked to a lot of people that you know, and I reach out to people who are, more public figures or whatever. At least so far, that's the trend for our different shows. But the thing that I've been sort of shocked by and even taken aback is that the lowest hit percentage that I have, so the people who are most likely to say no, are the people who I know personally.
Really?
And they maybe not be my best friend of all time, but it's like I've worked with them, or like I, have a long-standing history of expressing interest in their work. And I send them a message, and I'm like, hey, I'm doing this podcast. We'll describe what the message says more generally in a second. And I've been shocked by how many of those people say no, whereas all of the majority of people that I don't know say yes. And I think what it is that because in one case, it's sort of like, somewhere between a personal favor and taking on, more responsibility from your students. So it's about you giving to another person, either whatever your commitment level is to them. Just academics they've got so much responsibility in terms of their charges, and it's just adding to that plate. Whereas when you reach out to someone you don't know, it's not about the personal connection. It's about you offering them a platform to further their work and that's something. And so I feel like there's a really big conceptual distinction there is what I found, which I was really surprised by that. Both how many of the people that I don't know say yes, and how many people that I do know say no.
Yeah, that really just does surprise me, because I've basically only contacted people I've asked so far. I don't know. I've only asked people who I know so far, and all of them have said yes. And but then again, even I've now asked 4 people who I don't know. 2 said yes. One, I only sent the email 2 days ago, and so hasn't responded yet. And the other person said, sounds really cool, but like Corona, I have children and stuff, and I'm like, right now I can't. But ask me again in half a year.
That's a tough caveat right now at the sort of beginning of Corona. So I've actually been taking a break from the podcast for the past month, and it's been awesome. I've been taking a break from pretty much everything.
I was going to ask about that, because there's been no episodes.
There's been no episodes. I was wondering if anyone noticed, but at any rate, that's very kind and sensitive of you to notice. But let's see. So at the beginning, I was sort of like, well, who's going to have the highest probability of having additional time to do things? And that's when I reached out to Steven Pinker. who I was like, okay, well, Steven Pinker spends most of his time doing talks and shit anyway. So now that all his talks are canceled, he doesn't have kids, all the stuff. It's not like he's going to have nothing to do, but all of the things that he was going to do probably would have fallen through. And so that's when I reached out to him, and that one came through. However, I think the asterisk there is that if you look at if you follow Steven Pinker, if you just search him in Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts, he goes on everyone's podcast. So it's almost not. I don't even know that it's a badge of merit to get him on. People look at that and they're like, wow, that's a big name. It must have really taken some finagling to get that. And it's like, honestly, I don't think so. I think he was willing to provide his perspective and opinion into any vacuum into which he has the opportunity to do so, which is glorious. And I think that's one of the reasons why he is as famous as he is because he takes every damn opportunity he has to present himself like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would have somehow assumed almost the opposite. Actually, I have one question. So have you read many of his books then, I'm assuming?
Oh, yeah. I've spent way too many hours reading his stuff.
So I have one question. This is something that I've only experienced with Steven Pinker's books, and that really confuses me.
Yeah.
So I think I've now bought 4 of his books, and I've never gotten beyond page around 150.
Yeah.
And I finish every book I read pretty much. But somehow every single one of his books, I started. I'm really interested. And then after around 100 pages, I lose interest. Okay. And I don't know, and I can't identify why.
I think
and
this
it's
is
only with his books.
I think this is really fair. So let's take a case study. I don't know if you read this one, but Better Angels of Our Nature.
No.
I assume
that's what I want to try with.
Enlightenment Now. If maybe you picked up that one, which is
that's one I have at page 180 at least.
So I assume I haven't read Enlightenment Now, but I assume it's making a very similar argument. You know, it's a corollary argument to Better Angels. So Enlightenment Now is about how the world's getting better, and Better Angels is about how the world is not getting worse.
Right.
And so all the bad things are going away. And so the reason why it's hard to get through 800 pages of Better Angels is that if you believe this statement, which can be summed up somewhere between a statement and a paragraph, which is that overall, most of the things that we don't want to happen in society are happening less and less in the places which they happen most. If you just mentally entertain some version of that proposition, then you have got the most important parts of Better Angels, because every page of that book is just it's just reiterating a different version of that thesis. And yeah, you could pick up some details; they may or may not be interesting, but a lot of it is just saying, and this is where it gets to his books more generally. Here is a proposition which is going to engage quite a bit of controversy. That's part of the key, and I am going to hit you with every single piece of evidence that I can find in favor of that thing. So you're not actually in terms of like entropy, in terms of like the information that you're gaining. There's an argument to be made that it's not all that high on a page-to-page thing if you just accept the overall thesis, which takes about 180 pages to get on board with the main argument. You know, right? So that would be my theory on that.
Yeah, that's so. I think so. As I said, I haven't read Better Angels of Our Nature, but I have read Enlightenment Now, and with that book, what you're saying is exactly true. I think the ones before, I mean, I can't remember. This was usually a few years that I read them, but I think they might be a bit different. But with Enlightenment Now, you're 100% on the money.
Did you read Sense of Style?
I started.
I was wondering about that one because that's my favorite Pinker book. So I'm wondering what your take on that one is.
I think I got bored in the linguistic diagrams, how different words relate to each other. I don't know. I think that's at least when this is the thing. This must have been at least 5 years ago that I read that, or didn't read it, I guess. But just to quickly about Enlightenment Now, because I exactly agree. They're the ideas that, you know, these Enlightenment values help the world get better. And so it is split into, I don't know how many chapters, but each on a different topic. And it's like, okay, now we're going to read how war is not happening as much. It's like, it's good, but you see all the titles of the chapters, like poverty. Well, I can see where this one's going. Like, it's probably going to get better over time. And every chapter is like that. And he discusses all the things, and it's often very, how should we say, you do understand the issue a bit better and what some of the more subtle problems are. But yeah, it is exactly that. It's been sitting in my on my desk more or less for like half a year now or something, because I thought, like, do I really want to spend time reading how these topics are getting better?
The thing is that in a way he is extremely averse to narrative, which is why his work is so powerful from an intellectual standpoint, because he's not trying to trick you in any way. He's trying to just consider the evidence. But that's also why his books tend to be hard to read, which is because if you think about sort of what a narrative is from a reader's perspective, it is the experience of holding your book and saying, well, gee, I wonder what happens in the next page. And then you flip that, and then you find out. Whereas with the Pinker book, like you're saying, you hold your book and you're like, gee, I wonder what happens in the next page. The chapter is called Poverty. You know exactly what's going to happen. There's no question what's going to happen. And so it's antithetical to what a narrative is from a reader's perspective at its core, like that. But wait, before we need to talk about the cold email. We need to get into
this. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. So you're very proud of it, clearly.
Wait, no, okay, but so here's the thing. Here's my theory about this, is that the entire podcast that I do turns on how good that cold email is. That is the bottleneck, right? Because at the end of the day, okay, maybe a long time from now, once I've established myself, people will listen to it because they are interested in me. But that's way down the road of that sort of thing happening. So people's engagement with my show is going to be a function of how interested they are in the other people that I bring on there and how little I fuck it up. So to the extent to which I can bring on interesting people and allow them to be interesting without screwing it up, that's going to be success in the near term for my show. And so the bottleneck for that is, can I get interesting people that I'm excited about talking to and that other people will want to listen to? So to me, it's the most crucial point of the whole enterprise,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually also, I've listened to the ones where I was interested in the guest. So I'm not at the point yet where I listen to every episode of your podcast, but I'm at that where, like, that sounds like an interesting guest. I'll listen to that one. Yeah.
And I think that's the nature of interview podcasts, is that you have a couple interviewers that you trust. So for me, I really like Krista Tippett on Being. I think she's one of the interviews.
Krista Tippett?
Krista Tippett on Being. And she is, it's not really necessarily in our circle of psychology and neuroscience and that sort of stuff. But she, to me, is probably the best interviewer out there besides Oprah. So I take a lot from her. I take a lot from Sam Harris. I even like Dax Shepard a lot.
Who's Dax Shepard?
So he's this actor. He's famous for playing dumb people, but it turns out in real life he's really smart. And so he brings on everyone from academics, famous academics, to famous actors, and he is able to walk this line between being really dumb and really smart. And by doing so, he's able to encompass this really, really broad scope of humanity, right? Because there's something about dumb conversations that are attractive, right? Like, that's the majority of what reality TV is people doing dumb shit or talking about dumb shit. So there's something really important to the human experience about that. But yet also, as academics, we want ideas, we want smart stuff. And in being simultaneously both of those things, Dax Shepard does that really well. Anyway, so yeah, but the point is that you have 3 interviewers who are able to bring on whomever they want and are really good at what they do. And do you think I listen to every one of those episodes? No way. I just go through and be like, yeah, heard of that person. Oh, yep, that sounds good. Or every once in a while, you look at the topics of what they're talking about. I'm just describing how I do it, and so that's how I assume most other people do it. I think that there's going to be people who really like the the stuff that you do at a consistent enough basis that they'll put you into their every week slot. Shout out to my buddy Steve, who I know listens every week to Cognitive Revolution since day one. Anyway, so it's cold email. I've been plugging this now. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
So there are 3 sections to it. They're basically 3 paragraphs. So the first is it is the personalization of why I am reaching out to this person. And it's basically me telling them how much I love their stuff, which it has to be true. Otherwise, like, why am I even talking to that person if there's nothing I would put there? But it's basically me just being effusive and being like, wow, look, you did this stuff. And I just thought that was so great. And I loved it. And look, all that sort of stuff. And it's really just, it's doing 2 things, or it's doing a number of things, but I think 2 of them primarily. One is saying, look, this is not just a template email. This is really, I'm reaching out to you, not just because you have a bunch of Twitter followers, but I really deeply have engaged with your stuff and I care about it. And that's the first thing that everyone's going to look for is, because that's how you get someone like me to reject you, is if you just sent me a template thing, I might be like, oh, like whatever, right? But so that's a big thing. But then 2, I mean, what is the best predictor of whether or not someone wants to help you? It is essentially whether or not you can make them feel good by doing it, right? And because that's what they get out of it at the end of the day, is they're doing something because it feels good to them and they want to do it. And so sort of coming out with that and saying that I think is important to sort of seed that the kind of emotion that you want them to feel. And then the other sort of ancillary consideration, what was I going to say? Anyway, the point is that, so you sort of establish that you are talking to them directly and that you really value the work. Oh, the other thing I was going to say was that, as academics, we spend the majority of our time talking about how shitty other people's work is, right? No one ever, like when someone raises their hand and like talks about something in a seminar, it's like, hey, thanks for the lovely presentation, but I noticed you screwed up the most important thing, and that, and then you dive into, right? So that's what academic discourse is like, and so that's also what creative discourse is like a lot. Certainly every once in a while you get someone who writes in and says, hey, I really love your stuff. And that means a lot when someone does that. But the majority of people who are motivated to take the time to reach out and talk to you are people who want to flag something that they took umbrage with, right? That's the nature of when people choose to reach out and make their opinions known, is when they're pissed off about something. So, right. So, okay. So that's that first paragraph, is establish that personal connection.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yep.
So,
I kind of will do that. I try to do that too, but I kind of do that later in the email.
Yeah.
So my template is basically like, I describe that when I do a podcast, especially because I don't have anything to show them right now. Then in the second one, I say basically, this is why I want to talk to you and what I want to talk about. Yeah. And then
look, I'm not going to tell you how to do your stuff. Your thing worked with me, and I thought it was good. And you did get to the point there. I guess I'm surprised. I'm always surprised when people take the time to read something. That's also my
worry at doing it at a second.
But here's the thing. I think they do read it. I do think they do read it. But to me, the first filter that people are going to put you through is, are they reaching out to me? And if you can personalize it in that way, that's the first filter. That's the first barrier to entry. Mm-hmm. Then they're going to look at their schedule and be like, oh, can I take on another thing? Or, oh, so what exactly? So, like you said, you may have omitted key information about what your podcast actually was, but that wasn't that super important. It turns out, right? Because I could kind of intuit what was happening and that sort of stuff. Just an observation. Okay, second thing is that you have the why. You have, why is this podcast happening? Why am I doing it? Why am I reaching out to you? All that sort of stuff. And this is another part of my pitch that I've refined, which is essentially that, as you and I have sort of talked about, I think, off air, at the end of the day, academia and academics spend a lot of time talking about content, but rarely do we talk about the experiences of the people who create that content or the stories behind them. And I think this is really valuable information for people who are in positions like you and me, who are sort of starting off as early career researchers in grad school or postdocs or whatever it is. And we want to know that the people that we look up to, the people that we sort of venerate, were at some point in their career just like us, right? And went through the same sort of stuff and had the same sort of issues, and also had stuff get screwed up in graduate school and had to deal with these personal things, and also that there's a human behind the science. That to me is both super important and what I'm really interested in. So that's what I explained to them in that, and saying that, look, I think that it would be valuable to have your story as a part of this collection. And then the third paragraph is really simple. It's like, look, I'm asking you to do a remote conversation for an hour, no prep. Hopefully it'll be fun. So super, super clear ask, and just really concise. So that's the format that I generally use.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I feel like also this is something. I mean, I'm assuming you refined this over time, or was it? I mean, like I took for the first one to write, and I don't know, like how much I must have spent, like a few hours, like also because I wasn't quite sure what the podcast was going to be. Yeah. So through writing that, I also vaguely had to find it out. But now it's, I asked someone a few days ago, and that took like almost no time because I knew why I wanted to. Yeah.
Yep. Everything with these sort of things is a work in progress. You have a minimum viable product. I'm a big believer in the MVP, and you get it out into the world. You try that first iteration, and then you make it better every time that you do it. But here's something that I'm interested.
Real feedback.
I'm interested to hear a little bit more about your vision for what this show is, and why you wanted to start it, and I guess just what you're hoping to do with it, and what you envision the show to be like.
Well, it's very open right now still, because I mean so the brief answer is I don't really have a clear vision, and in part that's intentional. I've found that often it takes, you have to do something to figure out exactly what you want to do. So I remember the very first interview I did with my supervisor. In that one, I just wanted to, actually that was, I think before I actually encountered your podcast, I was doing something more like that. And I really wanted, in his case, to kind of take him through like his academic career, like what did you do then? How did you go? Why did you go there? How did that process work out? All that kind of stuff. But then once I did it, I realized like, nah, I'm not like, I'd like to focus on like a few individual things and then go more in depth on that, rather than going through someone's career and like spending 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, 5 minutes there. And so I found just that with every podcast, I mean, as you said, right, every time you do something, you learn something about it and you change it. And right now I feel like it's still in the weird phase where it is still changing quite a bit. I mean, there are a few things that I definitely want to do. One is that I often, and I'm assuming most people do this, I'll read a research paper and I think this is really cool, and then you have questions about it, but you usually don't know the person, and you usually, or often at least, don't know someone who knows the person, or at least not that you know of. And so you're kind of just left sitting there with your questions, and you can try and answer them yourself, you can ask people, but it kind of doesn't go anywhere. And so one hope is just that, all these papers that I really like, I can just talk to the author about the paper and say, like, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Just kind of discuss the thing in more detail. And I think that this is what academia often tries to do. You have talks, you invite people in, they talk about the research, you can ask questions, you can meet the person. But that's a very inefficient way of doing it, I think, because you have to have like 20 people or something listen to one person at one time. And, there's only so many questions that you can really ask in a talk. Like as soon as there's like more than a question every 5 minutes, it gets annoying. So
okay, let me see if I sort of have the vibe, which would be that, so someone gets invited to your university to talk at a seminar that you have in your department, and then they give that talk. then, there's a couple questions afterwards. But then after that talk, you go out to a bar for a pint, and it's just the two of you. And then that's when you talk about, sort of like, well, you said you collected the data. So what does that actually mean? And then you get really deep into that. But then it reminds you that, oh, well, it's because, there's this weird thing from way back in the day, and you get off track. So is that the kind of vibe?
That's part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's this kind of, I feel like, as we mentioned, or as we talked about earlier, papers only include certain kinds of information, even though a lot of other kinds of information is also super important. So that's part of it. But then another thing is I just have a lot of interests and would like, same thing, like to talk to the people about whatever that interest is. So I'm trying, how should we say, I don't really want to restrict it to academia only, even though I think in the beginning, probably most people will be academics.
Yeah. I think, to me, the way I think about that is sort of a beachhead market, an initial target market that's relatively circumscribed, that broadens out over time, right? So clearly, I think for both of us, we're going for interviews with the kind of people who would interest people like ourselves, right? So relatively niche market of graduate student in psychology, potentially, even with specific interests, and saying, well, those are the people that we're going to talk to, and we're going to refine that and build up, a listener base that's sort of centered around that. And for people who are interested in it, we are doing the thing that is going to be dead on. I guess I'll speak for myself. I don't know what you think about this, but anyway, this is how I think about it. I want to do something that's dead on for what someone like me would want to hear about. Someone who's interested in the personal side of things, someone who's interested in these topics, even these, sort of people, and in this style of long form, open-ended interview. And certainly those are things that not everyone is interested in, right? Even a lot of people, they don't really get the whole long form interview thing. A lot of people are not big on that. And they're like, maybe you should cut it down to like a nice truncated 30 minutes or something like that. But anyway, you start off doing that, and then over time, you build in other people. And I've got several people on my list, some poets that I want to talk to that I really like, some musicians, and, sort of begin to build out into talking to other kinds of people about the way they come at their ideas from their unique and personal experiences. So.
Yeah, I heard on I can't remember which one, but in one of your podcasts, you actually talk about your strategy. I think you said something like you start off very specifically for grad students, and then you kind of try and build something there, and then you broaden over time. And I was listening to that and thought, oh, that sounds like a really smart thing to do.
Yeah, because look,
I'm not going to do it, but it sounds like a way better way than what I'm doing.
Well, I guess it depends on what you're trying to get out of the podcast. For me, mine is, in a sense, it's a platform building exercise. And so if your goals are different for the podcast, then look, talking about the content, that might be just the number one priority. Anyway, there's a number of different ways to approach it there. But yeah, no, I definitely want it to start with, because, okay, look, here's the thing, right? So if you set out to start the next great podcast about happiness, well, look, Laurie Santos is already doing happiness labs with Pushkin Industries. She's going to kick your ass because she's better than you are. She's smarter than you are. She's got more resources than you have, and all that sort of stuff, right? So it's like, okay, if you want to go talk about happiness, great, but it's going to be really hard to do something that people wouldn't already have satisfied by listening to that podcast. So for me, you have to say, well, what can I do better than anyone else? Or what is the thing that I sincerely, want to do that I feel is missing, that I would want to listen to, that I don't think is satisfied out there. And I think that sounds like that's where you're coming from. Was what do I want to hear that I don't have access to, which is these kinds of in-depth conversations about the material, and then go out there and create that thing. And the nature of what that looks like is that that's going to appeal to a very small number of people at the start. And as you establish that, that's when you can grow to those bigger audiences.
Yeah, I still don't know quite how to think about that, because in one sense, I'm very certain that what I'm doing is going to be very niche. I mean, talking about to like one researcher about one paper they've written, unless that happens to be some paper that's like, mentioned in like New York Times or whatever, unless it's something like that, which I'm not going for, then the market's going to be super niche. But then again, even like niche papers are often downloaded 100 times or whatever, right? So I don't know, we'll see.
Here's another thing that's going to be a big benefit that you may or may not realize yet, which is that doing this podcast, if you think about it, it is the best possible networking opportunity in the world. And I mean that in the best sense of networking, right? So you and I, we're having this nice conversation, we're connecting, we're going to know each other afterwards. If we see each other in real life, we're gonna be buddies. And
if that ever happens,
if that
with
ever
COVID.
is even a metaphysical possibility in the future, and you're gonna have that week after week with whoever the people are, people that you care about and look up to and want to connect with. You're gonna have that over and over again. And so not everyone is gonna come out being your best friend, but if you think about, so from my perspective, a lot of the academics that I talk to, I get more in depth about who they are and the way they think about things in their personal life than they ever get with their graduate students, right? Because most
definitely
conversations between graduate student and PI are going to be like they're going to be within the defined spectrum of research and that sort of stuff. And every once in a while, maybe your PI has one beer too many and just lets a little bit slip at the and then you get a little insight into the mind of whoever she might be. So the conversations that I'm having that are explicitly about, so tell me about your personal life in a, sort of historical sense, not, give me juicy details about issues at home. The point being that in an hour, we'll get deeper than, like these kind of conversations that are about, hey, let's go deep on a topic. Doesn't matter if it's personal or academic. That's a connection right there, and it's ultimately a relatively rare one. And so, even if no one listens to your podcast, which I don't think will be the case, because I think that's another thing that's always surprises podcast people. Everyone that I've talked to who has a podcast is like, I was just shocked that anyone listened to it at all. And actually, the numbers turn out to be relatively large. Like, what is it? 2 psychologists, 4 beers. McKeaton's like, that's something he said. Same with Dave Pizarro from Very Bad Wizards that have been around since like 2012 or something like that. So no matter how silly one thinks one's own podcast is, there are still people out there, if you do an authentic job of it, that are going to tune in and be like, hey, yeah, this is my shit right here.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, I think also what I would imagine for my podcast especially be the case is that you'll have people who only listen to one episode. Just because, like, one researcher, like, for example, let's say Aaron, he has a paper that's fairly famous in the field. Like, people who are interested in that field might listen to it, but not to anything else. So but I definitely agree with the networking thing. So that's another reason that I thought, like, especially because, what I'm doing is really at the intersection of a lot of economics, psychology, neuroscience, some AI even, or sociology or whatever. Like it's a lot of different fields. And I mean, in part that can just be a bit overwhelming because it's just so much information. Every field does stuff differently. But I also feel like, just for example, we had one guest speaker who came in and who had a bit of knowledge of economics. And so I could just ask him like 2-3 questions and he could just clarify what that field was trying to do or something like that. And that just made a huge, it just clarified things so much more than I would have had I tried to read an economics textbook, right?
So that's why journalists interview people instead of quoting from their texts, right? Because when you read an academic's paper, if you are not versed in that academic jargon, then you're going to have a hard time getting into it, even if it's a relatively basic thing, as long as the field is sufficiently sort of disparate from your area of expertise. Which is why if you read popular pieces about science, the journalist calls up the scientist and is like, hey, explain this to me. And in the course of going over the same information they would cover in a paper, basically, they explain it much more clearly because, that's just the way linguistic communication works, and one of the reasons why writing is so difficult.
Yeah, and so there's part of that, but then to the networking aspect that I wanted to get to was that also, my supervisor does cognitive neuroscience, these kinds of, he doesn't know many economists. He doesn't know whatever, like sociologists or something, right? It's just not in all his field. So I think, as you mentioned, getting to, one idea is that I'll just also game theories focus on the different aspects there from all the different disciplines and talk to the people from different disciplines to kind of have one area where people can really understand that. That's a sub goal, I guess, of the podcast. That will, by definition, lead me to get to know lots of people in the fields, and whatever may happen from that. But I think it usually is a good thing.
So I have a couple questions for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So the first one is, this is something I thought about a lot in the beginning of my show, and I know where I landed on it, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it right now. Is what you're trying to do a conversation or an interview? And I think these are two very different mental models, though in casual conversation, it's perfectly fine to sort of interchange them. But the concepts that sort of people bring to them, where in a conversation, there's an assumption that you're going to have 50-50, approximately 50-50 split of airtime, and that both sides are going to sometimes answer questions, sometimes ask questions, and go back and forth. Whereas an interview has two main differences. One is that it's 80-20 in terms of airtime split, and then one side is going to be primarily asking questions, and the other side will probably never ask questions. That's actually a really shocking thing when it happens in an interview. So if you're listening to an interview podcast and the person who's getting interviewed asks the interviewer a question, you realize, whoa, I was not expecting that at all. And I this is a trick that I learned from listening to interviews with the author Elizabeth Gilbert. She does this really well. She's a super good interviewer and interviewee. She's famous for Eat, Pray, Love. Since that's probably a book, if you started, you only got 150 pages into it. But at any rate,
I haven't started that.
You've yet to start. It's really good. It's really good. But anyway, the point is that it violates the mental model. So, interviews or conversations?
Yeah, that is a good question, and it's, I think, something that I've been at times. I think I often have not made that boundary clear, and I've often, even when asking people, I said it's supposed to be a normal conversation, but then it is kind of an interview. So I find it a bit difficult to. So I think it is technically an interview. I think most of the time I ask probably more than 90% of the questions, but usually in the conversations I've had so far, the other person has also asked questions. So it's not a completely one-sided thing in terms of who asks and who answers, but most of the time. But yeah, I find it difficult, slightly difficult though, because I think unless it is kind of conversational and low key, or rather, I think it kind of has to be conversational, low key, for the other person to open up a bit and talk naturally, and not kind of have this well, this is the paper, this is what the design, to formally go through the paper almost again. I think it has to be fairly conversational for the podcast to make sense in that. I mean, or let's put it this way: if it was a completely formal interview, we could do it by paper. We wouldn't really, I could just send them a list of questions. But so yeah. Somewhat probably an interview, but also a bit of a conversation. I could imagine it would also depend on who the guest is. So if it's someone, there's some people I want to contact soon where I've read several of their papers and I have very specific questions.
Yeah.
that's probably going to be more like an interview. But I could imagine, for example, today that this is going to be a bit more of a conversation, or it already is more of a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely the casualness thing and how to so there's a tension here, which is that you have this red word at the bottom of the screen, which is recording. And whenever someone sees that on, they're going to be bringing this part of themselves that is this presenter kind of self, where they're trying to come off with a certain formality, or at least there's sort of this expectation of formality, because this is on record, this is forever, that sort of thing. But like you were saying, the ideal outcome is something that is it's light, right? It's not formal. It's not, hey, let's read the paper from abstract intro methods, etc. It's let's chat about it. So yeah, how to keep up that casual nature is something that I've it's one of those things that you continually are striving to refine how you do that and all those sort of things. So I definitely think that will gain clarity for you as you go through it.
That is actually something that I wanted to ask you about, because I think you do that quite well. I think you do manage to have a kind of, like, one thing when I was listening to some of your podcasts that how you often notice the things that you're not sure, or the things that you think might be your flaws or something like that.
And at the end, like after the interview.
Sorry.
Like I do that after the interview is like it ends, and I say, okay, that was my interview with so and so. This is what I think I screwed up on that.
Oh, right, you even do that. Yeah, I mean it more in terms of yeah, right, you do that. I forgot about that. Sorry, what I meant, I was trying to make a very simple point.
Okay, go
in that I think when I listen to your podcast, I feel like that guy's really good at making the other person feel comfortable talking to them, and I'm not sure how good I am able to do that. So that was just something I wanted to ask you about, like whether, I mean, it's not like here are my top 3 tips for making people calm, like tell a joke at the beginning, whatever. But is there, can you just expand on that topic a bit?
I can. So definitely that's one of the natural things that just, that's easier for me. That comes more naturally than other things. So that's one thing. But I do have a lot of strategies that I use to get better at it, because I do think it is actually a very difficult thing to do, no matter what your natural proclivities are. And so I've experimented with a lot of different things, but here's a few things that I have tried. So one of them is recording from the very beginning. So from the time the person enters the chat, so there's no talking between us before it's on record. And I tell them that, of course, beforehand, like in the email. But one problem that I've always had is that when you have the recording going, there's this thing where, so you have your first 10 minutes where you talk about whatever. And then you have this downbeat where it's like, okay, I'm going to start recording now. And then the nature of the conversation changed a little bit. And today you are circumventing it by saying, okay, let's just chat for a while it's recording. And
exactly,
yeah. Whenever it makes sense to start, I'll start. So that's my version of doing that. And then at the end, there's another thing that I've found, which is you stop recording, and then they suddenly become even more interesting than they already were. They do that thing where that's when they ask you questions, and you actually have a real conversation. Because then now you're open about all that sort of stuff. So I'm constantly asking myself that question: how the hell do you get that ending strip, which is so good because they're totally open and you get to know what they actually really think about things? How do you get them to do that while the recording thing is still on?
That's so true. I've noticed that, like with some guests I've done, it's like, man, these people got so much funnier as soon as they stopped recording.
They tell the jokes, they ask you questions, they tell you the asides. They do. So like, how do you get? So right, that's part of the issue that we're trying to solve. Another thing, so this is something that I stole from the interviewer Tim Ferriss, which is start off with a question that the person doesn't expect, right? So if you listen to that Pinker interview, right? So Steven Pinker interviewed at least a gazillion times every week, and often about the same stuff, right? Because he's tackled certain problems, or there's certain problems in the world, and people want Pinker to opine on them. So what did I start off with? Naturally, I started off with his collection of cowboy boots, and he has 5 or 6 in the closet. And I happen to know that because I'm both a Pinker fan and a cowboy boot aficionado. And I just happened to notice that he was always wearing the same pair of black cowboy boots while he was wandering around, seeing him out in the wild. And so we talked about that. And then I also happened to know from Sense of Style that he, his wife, Rebecca Goldstein, sorry, I might be getting that last name wrong. Anyway, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, they met after having read each other's writing, and he has this line in the book. It's like, I liked the author's prose so much, I married her. And so I was like, okay, so tell me about this literary romance. And he goes into this story about how they were, read each other's things, they corresponded briefly, and then they were on this radio interview together, and that's where they first hit it off. And between being this sort of weird kind of cowboy boot savant and having this philosophical courtship with his wife, those are the kind of things one doesn't expect from Steven Pinker from an audience perspective, but then also trying to jar Pinker out of canned answers, because that's the thing that you don't want from whoever you're talking to, interview or conversation or whatever, is you don't want them to give the shtick that they usually give, that they already have down pat. You want to give them something that they have to respond to in real time, that they know about and they're capable of responding to, but is going to elicit something that they haven't already rehearsed to the point of it being a canned response.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably something that I won't suffer with that much, because I think most people I will be interviewing, at least in the beginning, will. I mean, like I think you also mentioned it with Maria Kornikov, right? I think you mentioned that I think you might have mentioned that at the end of the interview with her, that it was something like you were really trying to get her not to recite the pre-planned lines.
Yeah, which is hard because she was on book tour, and that's
exactly because she was on book tour, yeah. And yeah, but so you just try and achieve that by asking them questions they might not expect. I mean, but the thing is, like, you can still, like, so I have to say, I haven't actually listened to the one with Steven Pinker, your interview with Steven Pinker, interestingly in part, I think, because I feel like I've heard him being interviewed so often.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe, and I was quite surprised to hear what you just said, the questions you asked him. And now I think I will actually go and listen to it, because it sounds more interesting than what I expected. But here, so to me, it still seems there's a slight problem that you can start off by those questions, but then as soon as you ask, like, so about your book, then they can still, like, switch, right? So I could imagine, at least.
So I think this gets into what's really the hardest part of doing an interview well, which is that there's this balance between what's happening in the moment and the structure that you have sort of in your mind. So you can come into whatever interview, or let's just use that word ambiguously right now. So you come into the conversation and you are like, well, so I have 3 specific questions for this person that are about their work. I have 3 general questions, which I ask more or less to everyone, and I have a general sense of how the things are going to flow. First, we're going to talk about topic A, then at some point we're going to get into topic B. Maybe if we have time, we'll hit topic C. And so as the person who is the leader of the conversation or interviewer, you have to be sensitive in real time to what is actually happening, what the person is saying, what they are doing, what they're getting into detail on that you think plays well. Because people, I mean, as great as tangents are, there are tangents that don't work. It is possible that it's like the person is just going off and talking about something, and you're like, this isn't interesting. This is just a digression into, something, and this is it. Like, we just need to get back to something more profitable, and I mean that in a less conniving way than it sounded. But But the point is that balancing that trade-off and being both attentive in the moment and aware of sort of the producer's role of what are we talking about here? Are we covering the things that I think would be interesting to covering? Are we going in depth enough in them? Are we going to finish this topic in time to get to the next one in however much time this person gave me? All of those things, doing that really well in sort of the abstract collection of all those considerations is what makes that is the center of gravity of what a solid interview is, and that's the hardest sort of skill I think to develop over time. And so yeah, that plays into what you were saying, which is like, okay, you can start off however you want, but then you have to it still has to have some sort of arc that's going to be comprehensible to whoever is listening from the audience point of view. So one sort of strategy that I use for that is that, okay, so you can have interview questions. Everyone's familiar with the concept of a question, and that's what you expect interviewers to have. But I often think of what I'm trying to do as a handful of things that I'm trying to get to the bottom of, right? So you have, maybe you have a question which is like, okay, so I saw that you started your career studying moral psychology, and then you transitioned into hardcore electrophysiology. What was the nature of that transition? So you have a question, that was what I just asked, but it's in service of getting to the bottom of something. What inspired this transition? And so when they start to answer that question, maybe they don't quite get to something that speaks to the nature of that transition. They go off and be like, well, whatever. And so you have to think, okay, well, in your mind, you have to say, well, okay, so let me try and revamp that and dig into something that they said or frame it in a different way that helps me get to the bottom of the thing that I'm trying to get to. And so that conceptual model of having a handful of things that you want to get to the bottom of and some working hypotheses about what kind of questions might get you there, that helps negotiate keeping all of those things in mind of, are we making sense? Are we doing something vaguely coherent? Is this person giving me the right tone that I want? And all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I agree. That is, to me, also the by far hardest part, that you're basically trying to do two things at once. You're trying to have a conversation and you're trying to, not work through a structure, but you have a goal. And I mean, so that's why, for example, now I have these notes here, but they're way less than they used to be in the first few interviews. So the first one I didn't prepare at all. Right. Well, okay, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I should be more
you
prepared.
Learn that
so
quickly.
The second one I went, okay. So I had like all these things and these papers I wanted to cover and things I wanted them to say, but that was obviously, I was just like putting words into their mouth. So that's why I just ditched all of those and started again. And now I kind of just have like, almost like you said, like a few topics or questions that I'd like to talk about. And then it's always just trying to steer towards that.
So I mentioned I had two questions for you. I asked one a long time ago. The second one was going to be about structure. So yeah, you, in your email to me when you reached out, or when you told me more specifics about what was going to happen, you said it was going to be pretty open-ended. You weren't going to come in with a lot of questions. And I have tried both, sort of approaches, from being very married to a handful of questions to like, fuck it, let's just whatever happens, man. Let's just have it be free flow. And that latter one does not work. It's very difficult to do. So I'm wondering how you're currently thinking about that, what you've been testing, what any troubles that you have, whatever, I don't know, whatever in that space of things you've been thinking about.
I think this might be something that I then didn't, how should we say, communicate quite as clearly to you, because in a way I do have a structure. It's just, I guess the point I wanted to make there was that it's not, as I said, I don't have like 20 questions and then I'll just go, okay, question number 1. And then you say something, I'll say, okay, thank you. Question number 2, as if like, as if I'm not going to react to that. So I kind of wanted to just say like, it's not going to be that, because the truth is like now, I mean, when I look at my notes, so I want to talk to you about podcasting just because we share that and in common, and because there's stuff I can learn from you. And then I have like other stuff I'd like to talk about is how you manage to combine this with doing a PhD and all this kind of stuff. And if we get to it, then also this preprint you have. And so I do kind of have that structure roughly in mind. But I guess, and I do have like questions or things I want to address in each of them. I just stopped writing those down because I feel like I kept focusing too much on the specifics of the question rather than being in the moment and having the conversation. So
yeah,
and then I mean, it's difficult for me to talk about like how this has changed for me much because I've only done 5 interviews so far.
Right.
So you're the 6th, or you're the 4th person I'm interviewing, but it's the 6th interview. And so yeah, I went from no structure at all to okay, that doesn't work, to very structured, that doesn't work either.
Yeah.
To now I'm just somewhere in between where I have a few points I want to hit, and sometimes I do have very specific questions, like for example the one I asked you earlier about what you do kind of to make the person feel at ease or feel kind of relaxed and calm. But yeah, mainly it's just these are topics I think maybe this is more how I think about it. It's more like this is a topic that could lead to something interesting.
Yeah.
And then we kind of see what happens.
100%.
And if I manage to get those questions in that are on the back of my mind, great. If not, well, whatever.
Yeah, you know, another quick thing about the trying to make people feel comfortable is that you have to be sensitive to what people are most confident talking about. So academics they often have a hard time telling personal anecdotes and stories and that sort of stuff. And so you have to, but some of them, they'll just give it to you and it's amazing. And you like give them one question and they just talk for an hour and a half. You're like, great, that's the podcast. Thanks. Bradley Wojtek was like that. That was like the most fun because I like the podcast is like an hour and a half. And I asked him 4 questions and the guy just goes off. And I
haven't listened to that one yet.
He was also able to do these amazing, he was also able to do this amazing narrative thing where he would do this thing where it's like, okay, so, you know, here's the thing you asked about. And, you know, like, there's the weird thing that happened. But in order to understand that, you have to go back to the beginning. And then he'd start off on this ridiculously far off tangent. And then you're like, after like 10 minutes from on it, you're like, where the fuck is this going? And then it would invariably come back to exactly where he said it would without him having to plan it at all. And it was brilliant. I loved it. But I didn't say, I hardly said, 20 words in the whole thing. Anyway, so being sensitive to what people are most comfortable, sort of the mode that they operate in, and trying to bring out the best in that. Because you're not trying to force them to do something different than that. You're just trying to bring out the best version of them. That's your sort of overall goal as an interviewer. But in terms of just the single easiest, so this is a hack that I found to be really useful for interviewing. And so I stole this idea from Ira Glass, which is, there's one question that will always work really well, which is, and how did that turn out differently than you expected? That's the question. And so the reason this works really well is because, so for particularly what I'm looking for, it's a little bit different if you're just about the ideas and stuff, but especially if you're interested in the personal stuff. What makes for good interview content is a couple different things. So you want a story, you want the anecdote, and then you want how they felt about it. And so when you ask this, so you want someone to say, their ideal answer is like, okay, so, I was in this situation and here's what happened. And you go through the story and then that's how I felt about it, right? So that's what you're trying to get at. And the reason this question works is because it gets you 2 things. So one is it gets you the story. So what happened, you have to describe that in order to describe how it's different than expectation. But because you have to describe expectation, it also gives you a theory about how the world worked. So they'll basically, it elicits a response. It's like, so this was my theory of the world. This is how I thought things worked. And then they tell the story. And then at the end of the story, you get their emotional response, but you also get their updated worldview. So it's like, now I realized that this theory was not actually how it worked, but it was a different thing. So that's a question that I always sprinkle in there somewhere when I'm trying to get more out of someone is how did that turn out differently than you expected? Also good if you're talking to just like a friend in a casual conversation and you want to get them to talk a little bit more. So I employ that in my personal life as well.
Yeah, that does intuitively sound like a great question. And now I don't want to like copy questions one to one, but that does sound like a really great question.
That's one you should steal for sure. Anyway, I could talk about theory of interviewing all day, too long for sure. And I feel like I'm railroading this conversation to that. So if you want to, actually, no, I want to ask you. So you are starting a podcast. You're in the opening stages of it. At what point in your PhD, were you like, oh, I've got all this time on my hands. I want to, I want to start a podcast. What's your sort of, how did you get into this?
That is slightly difficult to answer because, I mean, officially, in a way, I started just after our lab did like a corona lockdown in March, or our institute, or I started before that, I can't remember. So in a way, it did kind of coincide with me commuting less, me being, just having more time at my hands in that sense. But I have been wanting to do it for a while. And I think the main reason, I mean, part of it is probably just because now I had a bit more time because of the whole COVID situation. But then again, I think that might be more coincidence in the sense that this has been something I've been wanting to do for a few years. And it kind of just, it's been bubbling and getting a bit stronger all the time. And it happened to kind of reach a threshold where I said, okay, I'm just going to do this now when the COVID situation happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, it was around that time. I can't tell you exactly when, but it would have been around March when I started. Then it took me a while to figure out how to do the interview stuff. Then I did a few, then they didn't go that well. So then it took me a bit longer to figure out how to do it properly.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing this now in the sense properly for the last 2-3 weeks.
Yeah.
Since then I've been using this software and the setup. But yeah, technically since, I think I did my first interview in early April. Something like that. But I'm not sure I have too much time at my hands though.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that everyone has that idea at some point, which is like, you know what? I should start a podcast, right? Everyone's got a podcast. Why can't I?
Yeah.
But there's a big startup cost to it, and so that's one of the ways that I've. So first of all, we've mentioned, okay, so how do you balance, being a PhD student and having a podcast? First of all, I'll flag up front, I haven't been doing a great job of it. I'm currently behind on my PhD work. Mostly it's because of COVID, but certainly. I can't say that I'm speaking from a point of like, well, everything's flawless over here, so let me speak from my position of authority.
Let me tell you how to do it.
So I just want to mark that caveat up front, and so take whatever I say, interpret it with that in mind. But one thing that I will say is that when I started off this podcast, Cognitive Revolution, that I sort of thought about going into it was that...
sorry, I think you're fidgeting with something.
I am. Sorry, I'm fucking with something right next to me.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
I've been trying not to tap the table because the thing is so sensitive. The
the laptop
to tapping and whatever.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that was just yeah.
So one of the things that I thought about a lot when I was starting off Cognitive Revolution was that I knew it couldn't take up my entire life, right? Like, some of these podcasts that are very well produced, they take a team of people and, months to pull off and that sort of stuff. And it's like, okay, so I know I can't do that. And so I have to do something that respects the amount of time that I have to give to it. And so when I started off, I thought a lot about how I wanted to optimize that. And I guess there's two different stages of that. One was that, and I think, you took advantage of this opportunity, which was that you need some time to get things going, because there's lots of little things. There's like, okay, what technology are we going to use to record stuff? What technology are we going to use to edit stuff? How do you edit stuff? What mics am I going to use? Well, what kind of questions should I ask? Like, how do I send an email to people? And what, am I going to have music? Well, where am I going to get that music from? There's got to be a logo. Well, who's going to make the logo, right? And the answer when you're starting off is that you're going to do all these things. And
by the way, I've been ignoring most of those questions, but I don't have a logo yet. I still don't really have a name.
Yeah.
I think actually I'm going to go without music altogether.
Okay.
I think that's how I'm going to solve that problem.
Yep.
But yeah,
that is certainly one solution to the problem. But so anyway, the point generally, and even having omitted some of these things, you'll appreciate it, is there's so many little things to start off with. And that is really tough to do when you are engaged in full-time grad school stuff. And so I did that before I came to grad school. I knew this was something that I wanted to do. And so the 2 months before I started.
Sorry, how long has your podcast been going for?
Since October of last year. So this October will be 1 year. And
you started grad school?
Yeah, I started grad school at Oxford last fall in that October. So basically it coincided right with the beginning, right? So I started off, a couple months before grad school. I was like, I'm going to do this. And I started putting all the stuff together and doing the initial interviews and all that sort of stuff. And then, I had a few interviews in the bank, and then those dropped basically right on the downbeat of the beginning of my grad school term. And so that happened. And that was overall calibrated pretty well, because I would not have wanted to be dealing with the sort of auxiliary sort of nitty-gritty stuff like that at the beginning. I sort of want the wheel to be turning a little bit. And using COVID downtime, I think, is a good time. But I think that's a barrier to entry for a lot of people, especially if they're doing it on their own, is that the startup costs are relatively high. But if you play your cards right, and this is the second phase of what I was talking about, then it's not no work, but you can keep the wheel of the podcast turning with relatively minimal work. And so you've got your emails that you're going to send, and once you've got that dialed in, it still takes some time, because you have to write that personal section, at least in my scheme of things, and that still does take a decent amount of time, not 2 hours or whatever, but still it takes legitimate thought and all that sort of stuff. And then you have to prep for the interview. So that's one thing where I really cut down on time, is that because my interviews are not necessarily about content, and I usually have a vague idea of what the person's content is, I don't have to do prep work. I don't have to read the book. I don't have to read 3 papers. And so I do 30 minutes of prep before I talk to someone. I go to their website, I go to their Twitter, I go to their CV, I go to their Google Scholar top papers, and I have I select from my list of sort of general questions, and then here's a handful of ones I think would be interesting to ask them, and then come up with some specific questions about their particular trajectory. And so that's 30 minutes of prep. But that's really crucial, because I don't have to spend a bunch of time studying their stuff. And then, the interview takes an hour. And then, probably takes about 2x, whatever the length of the interview is, to edit it. And then there's some time dedicated to publishing it. But overall, we're talking on the order of 3 or 4 hours to produce an episode. Which, if you're doing an episode a week, you can do that. It's extra work, but you can do that. So that's sort of how I manage it. Also, just failing to live up to a number of requirements in my program is another way to find that time. So pick whichever strategy works for you.
Yeah, that is a question I wanted to ask you, like how much prep time you do, because I am, for what I do right now, I mean, I'm asking people whose stuff I've already read. I'm not, just going out to someone I have no idea what they're doing. So in the sense, like I have in a way done like hours and hours of prep work, but that can often be a while ago. But yeah, I do still usually read 2-3 papers now, or a book, or both. So yeah, that is something I've noticed. Like it, I spend more than half an hour prep. Actually, this is the only interview now, though, for which I didn't like in that sense. Well, for example, for the preprint, if we get to it later, I intentionally didn't read that because I thought it would be more interesting to hear it from you directly. But yeah, half an hour prep would be a dream at this stage.
So that's.
But then again, I should also say I'm trying to do one episode every 2 weeks. So I guess that kind of evens out in a way, in that I probably spend more like 4 hours prepping, but I don't do an episode that week.
Yep. So I mean, these are all parameters that you can vary based off how much time you have to give it and what you're going for, right? So for me, I want to talk about the personal stuff, and you can't do any research about that ahead of time. So that actually plays into
without becoming a minor stalker.
Yeah, I'm sure there are ways, but they're not necessarily appropriate for the situation at hand. But so that's not just, oh, I'm omitting necessary work, but that's actually something. And sure, I could dedicate more time to prep, but it's all about trade-offs, right? Is that the best use of my time? And so that's there's that sort of thing. And editing, you can do editing can take up as much time as you are willing to give it. So that's just something you have to say. This is so these are all things that you just say, well, here's what I have to give, and I'm going to make executive decisions about how I'm going to do it, right? And so for me, I want to do one a week, ideally, because as we've talked about, it's not everyone's going to listen to every one of your episodes. People are going to come in when they find the person interesting. So to me, part of what I want to do with my interview podcast is build up a repository of people that once people listen to a couple people they really like, and they sort of trust me as an interviewer to ask interesting questions and do a decent job, then they'll go through the back catalog and say, oh, okay, I'll put this one in the queue. And that's kind of how I imagine that sort of process going.
That's what I did. Yep. Great
to know that's N of one holds to be true.
Exactly.
So the point there is that if I can take not shortcuts, but if I can optimize things to come out with a larger N of people that I've interviewed, then that is going to accomplish my goals. Then more so than if I chose to dedicate, some amount of time to some other part of it. So that's just in my scheme how I've sort of chosen to allocate time.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is the difference here is just what we're trying to do, right? The thing is, like, I'm assuming, interviewing people who you have read their stuff, just not right now and in preparation for the podcast. It's not like you went to Google Scholar to sociology, looked at who had the most citations and interviewed them.
Mark Granovetter.
Yeah, exactly. I'm assuming that's
like,
that
wasn't
guy,
Mark Granovetter. Yeah. All right, let's hit him up.
No,
Mark Granovetter, right? I mean, he's famous from The Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell, and also bad-ass sociology papers. So, but
yeah, I actually haven't read any of those, but I actually really like their podcast. So that's one of the ones of yours I liked.
Oh, that's nice.
Sorry, the ones I listened to.
Yeah.
And I liked. It's not like all the others I listened to didn't like.
Well,
But actually, this reminds me of something I wanted to mention earlier, because you said one thing that's interesting if you have an interview podcast is when the interviewee starts asking questions. And I felt that was slightly the case in your interview with Mark Granovetter, because it seemed to me like towards, 2/3 or something, it seemed to me like he was getting interested in you and what you were doing. And then there was a point where it switched and he almost started asking you questions.
Oh, yeah. And that's why that was one of my favorite interviews, is because that happened. And you can't make the other person do that. You can't see them at the beginning and say, hey, like towards the end, could you ask me some questions about what everything might be interesting about me? So it's kind of a moment of magic when it happened, but it really did. And that's why I loved that interview, because I felt like at the end of it, Mark and I were like buddies. Like we corresponded since. Like, I sent him that paper that we were talking about. I read his.
Oh yeah, has he?
Oh yeah, he sent me back this nice email of like some things that he liked about. He read the thing. He was like, here are some points on how I think it can be improved, things that were omitted or arguments I didn't quite buy. We made some like offhand academic jokes about the American Studies scholar Perry Miller. He's not well known outside of the humanities. All But if you in like, I don't know what would be the appropriate scope of like an English department, like Perry Miller is this like behemoth in the field that was famous for sort of studying Puritans and that sort of stuff, which is why us social neuroscientists have never heard of him typically, is because he's not germane to our field to study at all. But we made these really, sort of niche jokes about that. So like that was, but that was the point is that was why that interview came off as well as it did, I think, is because by the end, you not only had learned about Mark Granovetter and his work, but you felt like you got to see a friendship, sort of emerge in that way. And that was a really cool effect that I thought the interview, maybe captured a little bit.
Yeah, it's cool. I guess for you it's cool that to learn that came across that way. But for me, it's also cool to kind of hear that I didn't just imagine that. I did find that really interesting, and I was wondering at the end, like, did I imagine him taking interest? But that is really cool. One thing I was interested in, especially, is like talking about trying to combine these different things. So, I mean, not only are you doing a PhD in podcasting, but you're also, as far as I can tell, writing. I didn't look at when you published your essays and that kind of stuff, but it seems like you're doing this still, right? And there was this one essay of yours that I read. I can't remember what it's called, but where you like outline your schedule, like the difference between planned and actual, or something like that.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I was like, the first thing that I found interesting about that is that it seems like you spend, I think you say like your most productive hours are like in the morning, and then what just surprised me is that you're spending none of that on your PhD. At least in that outline, it was something like writing, podcast, writing, or something like that. And I was just curious, is that like, that just surprised me, because for me, the PhD kind of work comes first, and then the other stuff is secondary. And
that's a very astute observation. Look, okay, so there's a couple different things at play here. So one, I mean, empirically speaking, that's why the podcast has gotten, the traction that it has, and there are a steady stream of essays coming out, and and my academic work is still in preprint and everything. So, I mean, you get returns on the things that you put your most productive time into, and ultimately, so here's the thing here's the additional information you don't have yet, which is that is now flipped. And one of the reasons why Cognitive Revolution hasn't come out recently and all that sort of stuff is that podcasting's going well enough, writing's going well enough. I've hit the goals that I wanted to have on that for this year, and I hit the marks that I want, and I'm really happy about that. But those are sort of in motion now, and so those need to take less priority. And so I have flipped that now to where science is coming first. I need to kick some serious ass on my PhD in the near future and get back on track. So that is, your perception is correct there. And there's that additional piece of information that is the sort of antidote to the issue you identified. But the other thing is that, at the end of the day, it's really hard to get an academic job, especially an academic job that one might want. And so I will try my damnedest to do good academic research and to find a postdoc and eventually faculty position that suits me. But I'm not married to it. And I do like research. I do like ideas. And we'll talk about this, some of the stuff that I'm working on. I'm hoping that, people find it worthwhile. And if they do, then maybe there's a future there. But at the end of the day, I know for sure that I want to have some sort of public facing, aspect of my career, whether it's podcasting and writing and all this sort of stuff. And, I described my podcast as an exercise in platform building. And that sort of is in service of this. It's not just a side project that I think would be cool, even though, in some sense that's what it is. But it's also it is an early step toward developing this sort of thing into a career, right? And I think podcasts are an excellent way to build a connection with, not necessarily followers or whatever you want to call them, but a group of people who are interested in you and your work and the way that you think and the way you interact with people in the world. And podcasts have a relatively low barrier to entry for listeners like that, with a relatively high sort of return on their investment in you, because they hear your voice. It's very personal. You're talking to someone they care about. Because that's the other thing from a marketing perspective, is that in an interview podcast, I get to temporarily take on someone else's audience as my own, right? So there's huge variation between whether or not you have Paul Bloom on the podcast versus someone who, people don't know as much. And people are always going to listen to the Steven Pinker and Paul Bloom ones more so. Or, if you have someone people love, like Sander van der Linden or something like that, that's going to draw a bunch of people. But at the end of the day, Susan Fisk, even though she's like the greatest person in the history of the world, she's not a public figure in the same way. So super interesting interview. Awesome. Anyway, the point is that different people bring different audiences, and you get to sort of co-opt it temporarily and draw in a small chunk of those people to be interested in your own stuff. Potentially, they'll just keep an eye on whether or not you have future interesting people, or look through the back catalog, like we were saying. So anyway, this podcast and my writing and what I want to do is done with an eye towards building a career out of it, either its own sort of deal, or as an add-on to my academic career. It's sort of a matter of which one goes well, because part of it's always going to be about, do you get a break somewhere? Part of it's going to be about how much work are you putting into it and that sort of stuff. And so I know this is something that I want to do. It's something that I want to have as an aspect of my career. And this is a sort of introduction for me to do it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And what I found interesting is that I think for the third or fourth time, you've almost answered a question I was going to ask. Like I had one question, and then I had one building up to that, and you basically went there anyway. So one question I wanted to ask was to what extent, or what you see after once you're finished with your PhD, like what you want to do, because I feel like I basically still assume I'm going to do a postdoc in these kind of things, but I do notice how should we say, you can do a lot of research without being employed at a university. At least, you probably need some sort of collaborator if you want to do neuroimaging or something like that. But I'm also working on some stuff that's fairly theoretical, or that can be done for not that much money. So I do wonder sometimes whether it might, I'd take a part-time postdoc or something like that, just get rid of all the administrative stuff that usually comes with being academic. But yeah,
the whole academia thing, being a professor, being a postdoc, gosh, there's so much bad stuff involved in this. And I almost feel like people like us, we get so into it and so on this track, and we just love the concepts and what we're doing and that sort of stuff. And we're told it's also very appealing, right? There's this very concrete path. So it's okay, you do your undergraduate, you do your master's, you do your PhD, you get a postdoc for 3 years, you become an assistant professor, you become an associate professor, and then you get tenure, or you get tenure after assistant professor. But the point is that there's a very linear thing. Here are the signposts, and that's very tempting, because most things in life don't give you something that explicit about that. And so I feel like
especially not writing,
so what's this alternative career that I'm working on? It's you're going to be you're going to be a public intellectual. What is that? What is that even? What is it? A writer? It's no, it's like Ernest Hemingway's, right? I'm not a writer. But no, the point is that, yeah, so I think pursue the academic stuff, do it. But at the end of the day, don't forget that you're doing it because you love the research and the ideas. But if you get married to that and say oh, I won't be happy doing anything else, fuck, you're putting yourself in a tough situation, because there's a lot that can go wrong there. And then you are married to a very, very suboptimal, because look, at the end of the day, it is a lot better to be outside of academia. Like just strictly speaking, in terms of personal happiness, you can choose the city that you want to live in, and you can go with your partner if you know, she gets a cool job somewhere else. You get paid an actual amount of money. Like other people get like, they get like not just like, oh, I can eat this week and pay for rent, but it's like they can actually do stuff. Um, you know, you like, there are interesting problems outside of academic problems. They get to do cool stuff, and and more people get to engage with it. So there's all these things. It's like, oh, outside world actually is a really good thing, and sometimes we forget about it. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make for me is that the way I think about it is like, yes, I'm going to give it my all. I still think it'd be really cool to do academia, but I'm not going to throw all of my eggs into that one basket. I'm going to have other stuff going on, and I know I'm going to do this in some form later on. If it turns out well, maybe it can be its own thing. But certainly, what I'm doing now is an initial investment in a longer term vision.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Shall we then talk about your podcast now, your other podcast?
So, yeah. So, speaking of not making sufficient progress on my PhD research, over the COVID period, I actually have been developing a new podcast. And this one is not an interview-based podcast. It's more of a story, episodic podcast where it comes out. There'll be an initial installment of, I think, 10 episodes in a first season. And so it'll be, you know, those 10 episodes will exist, and second season will come at some point in the future if I ever get around to it. But
it's not planned to be, you know,
it's not going to be it's not going to be at some set timeline where, you know, the seasons are going to come out at a certain point, or it's not like I'm going to do it like Cognitive Revolution, where the ideal is to have a new episode every week. And so, yeah, the podcast it's actually a travel podcast. And so the basic setup is that it's not necessarily discussing ideas, but it's basically travelogue, stories about places that I've seen and places that I've been, and trying to recreate the images and feelings and all that sort of stuff of those adventures. And sort of the kind of the conceptual motivation for it is that, so, you know, from Cognitive Revolution, clearly I'm interested in this strain of person that's the intellectual or the scientist or the writer or whatever you want to call it. Clearly that's something that I'm very interested in and want to dig into. But there's another kind of person that I haven't, that's also of real interest to me, that's not so much in that same kind of sphere, and it's the traveler. So the people who go out there into a foreign place or something they're unfamiliar with, and they come back and they try and relate what they saw, make sense of it, and give everyone else an idea of what's going on out there in the world. And this is something that I've been drawn to in a lot of different formats. One of my favorite writers of all time is Bill Bryson. And, you know, he's written some famous travel books about Europe, small town America, England, Australia. And I really like those books, and particularly the audiobook versions of it, because there's this very intimate thing in an audiobook or in a podcast, which is that someone else gets to take over your internal monologue, right? Like that's what's happening when you listen to someone else's voice like that in your headphones or whatever. And that's an extremely intimate thing. Someone else gets to take over your internal monologue. And so with him describing these vivid images of things that he's seen and doing it in this sort of stylized way, those have been some of my favorite audio experiences, especially in moments where I'm feeling trapped in a place, like during winter in Boston, good God. You know, just when I you know, feeling like I want to get out there and see it again. So I've been working on this, you know, travel writing vaguely in that vein of things for a number of years now, but it's very hard to find an outlet for it, a place to publish it, especially the longer form stuff. And so basically I took downtime during COVID to revisit some of those essays that I had previously written, write a couple more of them, and sort of put them into something that basically resembles an audiobook format. It's basically an audiobook broken up into podcast episodes. And so I talk about, just different places. They include Moscow, St. Petersburg, Istanbul, South Africa, a small country in the middle of South Africa called Lesotho, and then some places in Asia, including Hong Kong and Myanmar. And so each of them.
So just to interrupt briefly, each episode is about one place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing is, it's an essay where you read it, or is there also like some sort of audio, like some sort of sound effects or music or whatever?
Yeah,
it's like an idea of what to imagine what it's going to be like.
It's basically that read essay type of thing, and at a first approximation, whatever an author does when they read their audiobook, that's kind of what I'm going for. And I've always liked audiobooks that are read by the author. It just gives you that added layer of intimacy. And yeah, in the best case scenario, it would, sort of reach that, level of sort of co-opting one's internal monologue. And, I'll let everyone decide, whether or not they feel it's attained this, but the goal is for it to be light and funny and engaging, and to really make you feel like you are going to one of these places and seeing these things. So it's supposed to be vivid, and there's some drawing in of ideas and that sort of stuff, and concepts and sort of the intellectual edge and that sort of thing. But a lot of it's really about trying to hit that note of just bringing in these vivid images and a really engaging narrative like that.
How long are these going to be, the episodes? Is it?
Oh, they range. They're however much interesting content I have to say about a place, but they range from about 25 minutes to 45 minutes.
So they're pretty long then. Okay.
Yeah, so they take a long time to
for an essay. It's pretty long, right?
And honestly, reading them is a pain in the ass, because you have to get everything just right, and there's all these like, oh my gosh, it's this whole thing. So it's like, yeah, it's less work than you might think, because I had a ton of the content written already and just sort of had to edit it. So that was nice, but like honestly, even just recording it still takes a ton of time, and so I'm trying to wrap that up, and those are going to drop starting September 3rd. But I am really excited about that, because to sort of tie it back into my other interests is that so the connection between the scholar, the intellectual, the thinker, and the traveler is, of course, the anthropologist, right? And this is sort of a not so secret obsession of mine, are anthropologists, especially the sort of old school ones who would go to like, basically the setup is like, I'm going to pick the people who are most different from me on Earth, and I'm going to go try and make sense of what they're up to. And I'm going to go to some remote island or this or that and live in the jungle for a year, right? So that sort of let's say 1970s anthropology. I love those. And so yeah, there's two different things here. One is that in the long term, I have this, I would really love to do this, is to combine the sort of exposition of ideas that people like you and I are interested in as, science writers or whatever you want to call it, and these travelogues, and do it in a fresh way. That's sort of like, if you think back to 1999, 2000, when Malcolm Gladwell came out with The Tipping Point, and he had this really novel way of interlacing academic findings with narratives. And it turned out to be a really, really good formula, because it's the one that pretty much everyone copies nowadays. Malcolm Gladwell is a narrative genius, and I'm certainly not that. But in the same way of trying to come up with a new way of interlacing experience with ideas, which I think is this really high level of ability to encapsulate something about the world, is if you can capture both of the theoretical sort of abstract things about it, as well as the intimacy of what it's like to experience it. That's sort of this big goal of to me what I love about writing and ideas and all that sort of stuff, and want to capture my own work. And so in the long term, I would love to have these two strains connect from the sort of science, classic science exposition and talking about ideas to intersect with these travelogues. So that's one strain of it. The second thing, which is I think what we were going to talk about next, was the work that I've been doing in psychology is based around this idea of the intuitive anthropologist. Right?
Actually, can I ask one quick question before that?
Okay.
Have you actually done anthropological fieldwork or something?
No, I haven't done any anthropological fieldwork.
Is that something it sounds like you're really interested in it, and like as a, I don't know, like an internship or something.
Oh God! So here's the whole thing. So this oh my God! I have way too many opinions on this sort of thing. But anthropology so here's a question worth asking. If you're so obsessed with anthropology, why don't you go get your degree in anthropology instead of psychology? And I think that's a really valid question. And the answer to it is that anthropology as a field is kind of fucked up. And that's coming from someone whose field is in the midst of replication crisis, generalized civility crisis, and every other potential crisis that one could conceivably have in psychology. But just at the end of the day, psychology still purports to be a science. And I think that that's a good thing. And anthropology has gotten itself really stuck in the mud of the really difficult things about humanities, right? And so here, the answer to the question of why I don't want to do anthropology is also the answer to the question of why that pre-1970s anthropology doesn't really exist anymore. So why can't urban white guys go off to, remote tribes of brown-skinned people and come back and talk about it? And the answer to that question, one broad stroke of it, is that you have to start to ask, so what does it mean to successfully do that sort of thing in the way that it's purported to do? To what level is that project even possible? And that turns out to be a really, really difficult question to answer. And the way anthropology has elected to answer it for the most part as a field, cultural anthropology at least, is through basically the sort of schemas of the humanities and sort of critical theory and all of these sort of tricky things, which whether or not they are sort of useful, setting aside the question of whether or not whatever one thinks of them more generally, they make it really, really difficult to answer this question, because it turns out that it's really difficult to say in what way an outsider can go into somewhere and say, these are what these people are doing. And there's all sorts of problematic things about it. Like, it's really a vestige of colonialism and that sort of stuff. And so look, anthropology, as it's practiced in anthropology departments, I don't want to do that. So that's one reason. The second reason, which I'll keep shorter, is that to me, one of the things that I'm always trying to do is be somewhere that I don't belong, right? So I want to be somewhere where the way that I think about something is different from the way that people typically think about something. So to me, there's power in saying, look, psychology, cognitive science, that's my field of training. That's where those are the people that I, most am a part of. But I'm going to go and try and get this completely separate understanding of the way this other field thinks, and take some of their ideas and bring them back here and have that be at odds with the sort of mainstream thinking. So that's
basically sort of what an anthropologist does, right? You go for a different field and bring stuff back to your own
that's
field.
really the answer to the question. This is the meta anthropology going on here, which is that every experience is an opportunity to be an anthropologist, and to sort of put yourself in a position that is not the one that would be most comfortable for you, and to use that as a lens of understanding that. And that's in a much more, of course, informal way than what the formal anthropologist who has a title of professor of anthropology does in her capacity as an academic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then I think that is the link then to the preprint. So I think this is one reason I wanted to talk about this, because it seemed to me that I heard you talk about it in the podcast with Mark Granovetter. And there were some things that I thought where I didn't agree with you. So I thought that could be kind of interesting. I didn't write them down. I don't have a list, but if you could, I think if you just explain kind of what you want to do in your preprint, then I think we can have an interesting conversation about that.
So
or this
yeah,
whole topic.
The title of the preprint is The Intuitive Anthropologist: Why Intuitive Psychology Falls Short for Understanding Those Who Are Different. And the basic idea is that, so for a long time now in psychology, going back to, I think, 1977 with Lee Ross, you have this notion of the intuitive psychologist. And this says that when one human being is trying to understand the mind of another human being, essentially what they're doing is what professional psychologists do formally in an informal way, right? So they're trying to approximate whatever it is that professional psychologists are doing, and then this is how they're gaining their insight into the way other humans behave. And so from this spring all of the sort of touchstones of this sort of social psychology, like theory of mind and mentalizing and empathy, cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, whatever your favorite label for this general phenomenon is. And the sort of observation that I want to make in that paper at a very high level is that, okay, so you have intuitive psychology. That's a really useful concept. However, psychology is only one of the fields which is sort of invested in the enterprise of understanding human behavior. It also happens to be the one that we psychologists are involved in. And so doesn't it seem likely that maybe there's a little bit of chauvinism going on here, saying, oh, you know what we do? Well, that's what everyone else is doing, and just sort of leaving it at that. And of course, there's other kinds of intuitive theories, as they're called in the field. So you have intuitive physics, you have intuitive biology, you know, like whatever, these sort of folk theories about how the world works. But there's not as much work done on, you know, sort of bringing in something like the perspectives from the other social sciences, so like sociology or anthropology. And the reason one might think that we're leaving something on the table here, looking at what anthropology or sociology does, is that, so if you think about the setup of anthropology, like we were talking about, is that, so you have one person, the anthropologist, and you have another person who is, you know, whatever, the person who's to be studied. And the anthropologist tries to select that other person such that they are as different from them as possible, and then go in there and be like, what do I do to try and, this person's so different than me, how do I try and make sense of that, right? And if you look at anthropology, as difficult as we talked about, as difficult as that problem is, that is a very different kind of problem than what psychology is suited to do. So what psychology is suited to do, and what it's always held as a sort of philosophical point, is psychology is looking for what's common between everyone. It's saying, look, what is the invariant mind that we all share? How do neurons work? Because presumably that's the same way among everyone. How do the faculties of long-term and short-term memory work? Presumably that's the same among everyone. And you want to build out this sort of core deal of cognition that, like, you could go and find those things on every person on the planet. And so there's this really deep philosophical difference where psychology is looking for things that are common between people, and anthropology is looking for things that are different between people. And I think when we rely almost exclusively on the notion of intuitive psychology, we are we're basically going to find the same issues in our understanding of the way other people understand each other. We're going to understand a lot about how they understand what's common between the minds of everyone else. So for instance, if I go look at the water bottle on my desk, then you think, oh, well, he's looking at something off the thing. I wonder what, you know, right? So everyone looks at things, and you can look at people's eyes. And so a lot of theory of mind work is like, oh, if this person looks over here, what do they know about the world? That's the like Sally Ann task, where you have boxes and dolls, and they're switching and who knows what and where and all that sort of stuff. And the point of anthropology is, like I said, to look at differences. And it turns out that the methodology for doing this is very different than...
So can I interrupt you on the point of anthropology there? So what... You said two slight difference. You said the point of anthropology slightly differently there, if I remember correctly. Once you said is anthropologists try to find differences between people, something like that. I can't remember exactly how you phrased it. Anyway, my question is kind of, I don't know much about anthropology, so this might be just a misunderstanding on my part. But it always seemed to me that they were trying to find people who are different from them to find the commonalities. Is that not what they're trying to do? Like they say, okay, we're going to go to some tribe in the Amazonas who, share none of the structures we have, and then we're going to see and like how are they similar to us to find the universal features in humans. But
yeah, so that's a really good question.
Assumption.
That's a really good question, and the answer to some extent is they are trying to do both. And I think the sort of easiest dichotomy is that theory tends to focus on things that are invariant among people. So, for example, a famous anthropological theory would be structuralism or functionalism. Structuralism being that all cultures are made out of the same building blocks, and you just rearrange, those building blocks in different ways. And functionalism being that every, sort of ritual or thing that takes place in a culture is meant to serve some sort of function, or it accomplishes some sort of goal. And so, you would look at that and you'd say, okay, well, yeah, if you're a functionalist, then all cultural happenings serve some sort of, function, and it's your job to find out what they are. But that would be something that is the same amongst everyone. But then an example contrary to that is that the sort of primary deliverable that an anthropologist, sort of comes up with, their academic papers, are called ethnographies. And this is a description of, so I went there, it always starts off with you're describing their kin relations. So in the West, we have, fathers, grandfathers, mothers, grandmothers, sons, daughters, uncles. And then, but in some cultures, everyone who is X counts as your uncle, or there's some, second cousin twice removed is a special thing. So they start off, and so that's specific to that culture. So ethnographies tend to be about the specific things these are the peculiar things this person does. Of course, that links back to sort of the problematicity of anthropology, which is that you're exoticizing brown people, which is not a great look for white people. But
are you?
Well, so this is why anthropologists...
like you just... I mean, to put it the other way around, if they were to come to Western Europe and find the differences, I mean, that would be the same thing, right?
I'm glad you asked that question, and the answer to that question is that this is why anthropologists don't do very much interesting stuff, in my opinion, is because this dialogue, they've been stuck in this dialogue for a very long time. It's like, but is that a problem?
Okay.
Well, yeah, but here's, and like in a sense, so there's a lot of that, which makes it very hard to proceed on that. Anyway, that's just my sort of opinion. So I want to set that question aside, because I think if we dig into that,
it's a separate question. Okay.
It's a really, let's just suffice to say, it's a really tricky issue. It's a really tricky issue. And it's not at all easy to disentangle. And there's a lot to consider there. But anyway, so yeah, we were talking about, so anthropologists, let's be honest here. I am making just egregious simplifications about psychology, intuitive psychology, anthropology, intuitive anthropology. So there's always going to be some question in the form of like, oh, but if you were to get more specific. So yeah, sure, those are all fair play and you should ask them, but I'm making dramatic oversimplifications. But I think they give us a useful conceptual starting point. And so the point that I want to make is so let's take this idea seriously, that we should be looking at the notion of intuitive anthropology in the same way that we look at the notion of intuitive psychology. What would we start to look at? And so it turns out, in my reading of anthropology, as a non-anthropologist, is that when you really get serious about looking at the methods of anthropological fieldwork, which were developed mainly in 1922 in a text by an anthropologist named Bronislaw Malinowski, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And he basically invented modern anthropological fieldwork. And there's not that many methodological updates that have been done since then. Because at the end of the day, when you go somewhere and try and understand someone else, there isn't an algorithm or an experimental protocol that's going to get you from a place of not knowing anything to knowing a critical mass of stuff. It's a much more free-form problem. And so the question of whether or not you do a decent ethnography or are successful in your anthropological investigations is not so much about some sort of fancy mental gymnastics about empathically putting yourself into that other person's shoes. It's about, are you putting in the effort to do the hard work of spending every second you can with these people, trying to learn their language, trying to be with them in every possible situation, trying to experience some of the things that they experience, trying to ask them about what you're missing when you're not experiencing those things. The basic idea of Malinowski's methodology is called participant observation. You participate and you observe. And the whole point being that it's not about the mental gymnastics, which is what theory of mind is. It's some algorithm for saying, how do you get into the mind of another person? How do you successfully negotiate all that sort of stuff? But it's actually about motivation. Are you willing to get your ass into the field, into a tent, under the mosquito net, and sit there for a year until you can speak the language and understand this stuff? And the point is that when you look at divisions in the world today, like between Republicans and Democrats in the US, there's a complete lack of that connection of one camp willing to truly engage in that way and say, look, I'm going to do the hard work of existing with these people who I don't get at all. I think they're ridiculous. I think they're totally off their rocker. And I'm going to go, figure out what they're thinking about and how they really live and where these ideas are coming from. And so that's sort of the full circle thing, is that I think for all its faults, anthropology shows us that it's a question not of, sort of an intellectual edge, but it's whoever goes out there and spends the time with them. And when we look at the inability of people to make sense of minds outside of their own social group today, to the extent to which you think that's happening, it's for that same sort of lack. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just not entirely sure. So, what are you proposing then for psychologists to do, or is that not part of the paper?
God,
it seemed to me like you had like a suggestion, like like we're lacking this thing that they're doing, and we should do.
So one thing is that, in sort of just conceptual strokes, we need to distinguish between when you're doing some version of intuitive psychology for an in-group versus out-group member. So most theory of mind studies don't look at this sort of thing because if you've got something like the majority of theory of mind tasks are about this really minimal version of theory of mind, where it's like you either understand that this other agent has mental states and those mental states are different from yours, or you don't get that, right? And so it's used as a sort of diagnostic tool for autism spectrum deals or for infants. And a lot of theory of mind stuff is sort of co-opted from that and then used on healthy adults and on all this sort of stuff. And so we need more robust theory of mind paradigms to capture those gradations of things. And because these are worldview beliefs. These aren't beliefs about, is the doll in box A or box B? These are much more sophisticated beliefs that are legitimately harder to capture in experimental paradigms. But because we focused in on the experimental paradigms and not as much the real world situations, we've missed this key part of what's happening. So dimensionality is one thing. So pretty much all theory of mind paradigms are one-dimensional. Either the mental state is true or false, or A or B, or whatever it is. And crucial mental states that are going to be different between different members of different social groups are multidimensional. And so they'll, whatever you're talking about, they're just going to be basically more complicated, but having some sort of experimental paradigm where there's more happening like that. But then my favorite concept that I want to bring in from anthropology to psychology is this concept of something called thick description by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. And so this is actually a super famous concept. So if you compare it to prospect theory, potentially the most famous theory in sort of behavioral economics, or this decision psychology, whatever you want to call it, it has like 60,000 citations. My numbers might be slightly out of date, but it's 60, 70, lot of citations. Nobel Prize winning. Thick Description by Clifford Geertz, that the book that it's from, has 100,000 citations. It is, strictly speaking, from that measurement, a more influential theory. Yet you'll never hear it once in a psychology department. It's basically a theory about what it means to understand other people, and it has to do with, sort of getting into, it's this whole thing, and we can talk about it if you want. But basically, bringing that theory into the psychological parlance would be something I'd like to do.
Yeah, that was one part that really that kind of caught my attention in your conversation with Mark Granovetter, is that I'd never heard of the guy. And although funnily enough, then 2 days later, I'm reading, one of the books I'm reading it's called The Utopia of Rules by David Graeber. He wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs, which was fairly famous a few years ago. Anyway, I'd never heard of that name, and then of course 2 days after hearing you talk about Clifford Geertz with Mark Granovetter, I read that name in one of his books.
Now that you know that name, you're going to see it lots of places, because it's really hard to touch any sort of anthropological work. And, David Graeber is an anthropologist, without touching on Geertz. Or the conversation, I think my most recent cognitive resolution podcast is with Daniel Everett, who's a really awesome anthropological linguist. Amazing guy. Oh my God, literally the closest thing we have to Indiana Jones. But the epigraph to his book is a Clifford Geertz quote. So it's this and Clifford Geertz was like the greatest academic writer of all time. So okay. He's very much my hero.
So you'd recommend that book?
I'd recommend The Interpretation of Cultures, which is his most famous collection of essays. The first one there lays out his theory of thick description. It's I don't think there's a guarantee that you're going to, anyone could pick it up and be like, oh wow, this has answered all the questions. I don't know what your average neuropsychologist, whatever would make of it. But if you dig into it, there's a lot there. And then the last essay in that collection, notes on the Balinese cockfight. That, oh my God, now that's something, it's so good.
Okay, I have to buy that. But could you then briefly outline thick description and what are we lacking that can at least partially be solved with that process, or whatever it is?
So I think, to me, thick description is most easily illustrated by starting with what would be a thin description. So a thin description of anything, of a culture, of a person, of a place, of this or that, would be basically a single dimensional data point, right? So if you said, I'm going to describe the United States of America, and then you showed me a graph that was, political views as a function of population density, that would be an interesting graph, because you would see, these liberal, ideologies tend to, be in high population density areas. Wow, okay, that's interesting. There's lots to unpack there. But if you just left it at that and said, that's the United States, that's a thin description. And so what a thick description seeks to do is say, well, how do you describe as much of it as possible? How do you really get into, as close to describing the multidimensional reality as possible? And so that's why it's hard to give a positive definition of it, is because it encompasses potentially everything. But the sort of point of it is that you have to have an experiential component of like, it can't just be, here are all the empirical facts about it, because then you are missing out on some key aspect of it, which is some semblance of what it's actually like to be there, or to experience it, and some kind of thing. So that kind of ties back to what I was saying in, my goal as a writer, and what I love in writing is when someone can capture both the theoretical, here's how to think about something abstractly, as well as here was the experience of what it was like to be there. And so thick description in its sort of apotheosis is when you can capture both a theory about what is transpiring, as well as the phenomenological experience of what it's like to be there while it's transpiring. So it's tough to wrap your mind around.
That would explain, though, why this isn't adopted or even known in psychology and neuroscience, right? Because that's by definition subjective, right?
Yeah, so it's tough to incorporate. I mean, it's definitely not an easy slot in. It's like, oh, you have your Bayesian prior. Well, if you just take out the Bayesian prior and put in thick description, then you're good to go.
Easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're proposing just like, this is something we're missing and we should be paying more attention to, rather than, and here's how we do it.
Yeah. I didn't want to have to wait to figure out exactly how we should do it before getting the idea out there. So I think what I've described is worth saying personally. Everyone can obviously make their own judgment about that, but I think those things are worth pointing out, and I think it's going to be a long project of reorienting it. And so I would certainly like to contribute to that effort. But I think the delta between sort of identifying this project and saying, oh, look, I found the theory of mind paradigm that describes every discrepancy that I have pointed out. I've still got a few years left in the PhD, so that's what I'm going to spend that time working on,
Okay. That was actually something I wanted to ask. Is that something that's actually part of your main PhD work, or is that something kind of in addition to? Because it wasn't quite clear to me whether, usually in your PhD work you have like an experiment you do with your supervisor or something, right? Whilst this is more like a perspective thing. So I was curious, is that something you're actually...
This actually works out nicely for my PhD stuff, because one of my advisors, the one that I've been working with primarily for the last year, his name is Matthew Apps. He just moved from Oxford to Birmingham. He works on motivation, basically. And he is a phenomenal experimentalist, one of the best experimentalists I've ever met. And so I am currently working on intergroup versions of his previous motivation work. So the general question he looks at is, okay, we all know that people are motivated to earn rewards for themselves. What about if you have a setup where you can earn rewards for another person and put an effort to do that? How do people negotiate those sort of pro-social effort situations? Really interesting question. Hasn't yet looked at it. And well, what if that person is an in-group member versus an out-group member? That's what I'm currently working on. And then you can see that there's sort of a bridge from that to like, okay, I can earn rewards for that out-group member versus I can do the effort to understand that thing. So that's the first extension is intergroup. The second extension will be, how do you generalize that to perspective taking, intuitive psychology, theory of mind, cognitive empathy, etc. And that's my second PhD supervisor, Jeff Berg, currently at Oxford. And I'm going to be working with him more over the next couple of years. And so that's where hopefully that stuff's going to start to develop.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like something that's... in a sense, it sounds like you're trying to... it's kind of a paradigm shift, right? In a way, to say, okay, we have like this way of doing it, but we really need to like change gears or add something. But I mean, it sounds like this is. I mean, that's not a trivial problem to be working on.
I mean, I
That's
will
good.
certainly attempt to shift the paradigm. Whether or not the paradigm gets shifted is up to everyone else. Um, but yeah, this seems to me like a thing that if you asked me, so Cody, what do you think most psychologists are wrong about, or what do they insufficiently understand in general or as a field, or what do you sort of what's the conventional wisdom that is most wrong or most incomplete? That's the answer that I give. So in that sense, yeah, the topic that I've selected to work on and live or die by in my academic career is one that I think answers that question. But like we've talked about, the sort of issue is like, okay, so you have thick description. That's great. I'm glad it works for, sociologists and David Graeber and everyone. But can you successfully incorporate that into, the notions that we have in psychology and cognitive science? I don't know. I'm going to give it a shot, and I'll let you know in a little while whether or not anyone buys that.
That sounds great. Yeah, I'll definitely check out your preprint for more detail then. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I sometimes wonder like whether, like thinking about my own PhD work, like I feel like that would be so cool to have something like this is something that people are lacking, and I'm trying to, like, I feel like I'm still like looking for a problem in that sense, like something where I feel like this is something that really needs to be addressed. So in some sense, I'm quite envious of you having a clear direction in that sense.
Yeah. So how do you feel like you begin to think about that, or what do you? Yeah. I mean, yeah.
What do you mean, like how
How
I'm
does that play
trying
out for
to?
you? Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's. I mean, so I'm working a lot on cooperation, um, and so in incorporating game theory and these kind of things, and so I had done a bit before starting my PhD on this, but not that much. So I pretty much came to this completely new, and I guess like I'm still just trying to figure out the field in a sense. I mean, in a sense, there's also several fields because you have evolutionary biologists doing it, economists, psychologists, and all sorts of people working on this. Um, I don't know. Right now, it's a kind of like, I guess, finding smaller problems and thinking like, hey, shouldn't that be something? And then trying to work on that. Um, yeah, I should say it's just like the kind of thing that I keep having in the back of my mind. Like I'd like to have like a kind of grander, not grand in that sense, but like just bigger, a bigger problem that I'm working in that sense,
I mean,
rather than having like an existing framework and like adding to it a bit.
uh, you know, I guess far be it from me to suggest what one should do for one's PhD, since I have not successfully completed my PhD yet. But certainly my strategy on that is to steal ideas from other fields, right? The outsider perspective, like we were talking on, because I mean cooperation. That's like the best. It's like the single biggest like social phenomenon in the history of social phenomena, and everyone knows it, and economists know it, sociologists know it, psychologists know it, evolutionary biologists know it, and so to me the question would be who you know who has looked at this, but the core group of people, we all know evolutionary biology and economics and game theory and this and that. Those everyone, all of those have studied it. Who has a perspective on it that is not yet part of that sort of literature? That to me is where those quote paradigm shifting ideas come from, right? And if you study the history of ideas in whatever field you like, I'm particular to anthropology and cognitive science. But that is where they always come from, is someone who is not inundated with the sort of traditional theories of the field comes along and says, well, here's a totally different thing that these other people came up with, and puts that in there. So that's, in my interpretation of Kuhnian paradigm shifts, that would be the sort of main way they come about.
Yeah, in principle, I agree. I wonder though with cooperation, because it's so. I mean, there obviously are things that people are not looking at, but because, there's also anthropologists, sociologists, computer scientists, like all these people, just pure mathematicians or whatever, working on this, or well, I guess it's more like applied mathematics, but I wonder whether maybe this is just the big problem, trying to find one framework to fit it all in. In some sense, I guess game theory is kind of the connecting tissue because it provides one mathematical framework into which you can put all these, like from whatever angle you want to do it.
Wait, so okay, one thing I want to flag there is that the other problem with cooperation is it's something we understand decently well, in my understanding of it. And there's like part of the thing that sometimes you have to look for is you need to look for places where people are really confused, right? And social psychology is a great place to look for that because there's so many places where people have no fucking idea what's going on, even though they've been looking at it forever. And theory of mind, broadly construed, this whole intuitive, I mean, it's a mess in a lot of ways. There's a lot of great work out there. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean to denigrate any one single person, but in terms of, a field that knows what it's about and the best way to look at it and all that. Oh, no way, not even close, right? So the other problem with cooperation might be that we understand it pretty well and we have pretty good models. So this actually happened to me, which was that before I was interested in this sort of stuff, I was really interested in Bayesian models and reinforcement learning models, and did a lab manager stint with Sam Gershman, who did, just like,
he does everything. Yeah.
He does everything. What I should have done from a career perspective is some continuation of Sam's work, because I would have, that would have been a good move. However, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do something different. And it took me a while to figure out why I was feeling like that, because I was so enamored of these computational models for the first couple of years after I found them. And the problem that I have with them is that they're too good. To me, they do too good of a job of describing what it is they're trying to describe. And so I have lots of friends who are working on this, so I don't mean to belittle their contributions. But for me, I look at that and it's like, if you work on the Bayesian line of work, that's on track. It's going really well, and you're going to come up with some good papers. But the probability of a game changer, of a paradigm shifter, very low, because they work really well for what they're trying to do, and they're super useful, and they're one of the best things that psychology has come up with. And so it's like, what, or at least in retrospect, this is my sort of post hoc theory about why I switched out of that. It's like, well, I have to find something that's screwed up if I'm going to find a novel way of contributing to it in this maybe, quote, bigger sort of way.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. That's something I've also had to think about because, in part this was just because I didn't get positions, but I have applied for some things where that was really something I was wondering, like, should I go into that field? One is, for example, the whole grid cell stuff, was, especially now, there's a lot of stuff about applying the spatial navigation literature to general cognition. And it's super interesting, and I love reading about it. And, had I been given the position, I probably would be doing that now. But I do wonder all the time, like, man, like exactly what you said, like that. What should we say? Like that train is going down its railroads. It's going pretty fast. It's doing really well.
Oh, 100%.
Like, I'm not needed. It doesn't need me.
Like, I think part of the question is, if I were there, would I be able to add something that wouldn't otherwise happen?
Exactly, yeah.
And the answer for grid cells, I don't know, man. For Bayesian cognition, I'm not sure that I could bring something to the table that I could do something and it'd be cool, but I don't know that I would be able to come up with something that is truly a unique, an idiosyncratic contribution to what the train that's already going on, So I think that's totally a thing in science, and it's something we don't talk about as much.
Yeah, I guess the kind of finding your own path is probably the hardest thing in a way. Well, I guess, or not. I guess it really depends. I mean, I remember like E.O. Wilson, I think it's maybe in his book, It's like a book. What's it called? Like Advice to
Letters.
Young Investigators, something like that, or Letters to yeah. I think it's in that one where he describes something like he just liked ants and did it, and then like he was one of the top 5 researchers in the world half a year into his PhD because just no one was looking into ants and that they're super interesting. I think maybe sometimes you just fall into that kind of thing.
That goes back to the market size question that we were talking about recently, or at the beginning, several hours ago. Was that if you're starting a podcast, do you tackle the largest thing? Or do you start the happiness podcasts? Or do you do a niche thing and then just, this is what I want to do. I'm going to do the niche thing. And, if it grows into something big, great. If it just stays with the niche thing, that's fine as well. So I feel like that's a pretty generalizable, that's something you can take to the bank, are the dynamics of that. Because that's true for business. It's true for marketing, any creative endeavor. And science definitely falls somewhere between one of those two categories, somewhere between a business and a creative work. It definitely has a lot of commonality with both those things. And so, picking something that no one else is working on, I think is a pretty bankable strategy for sure.
I guess the only problem is you can't ask for advice for that in a way, because like I think a natural thing when you don't know what to do is to look for what other people are doing. But that's kind of exactly what you almost shouldn't be doing in a way, because if you're looking for what other people are doing, you're in that mindset in a way, right?
I mean, look, let's be honest about this. What I want to do is what we're talking about, but that's not what everyone wants to do, should be doing. It's not what it behooves the field for everyone to try and do. And so I think there is still a lot of merit for people who are not of the same mind about what we're describing philosophically, and they're better suited to a different way of thinking about things. And science is going to progress really well, not because people like me come and be like, well, what if we think about everything differently? But because they're making actual progress on like, so what's the actual contribution of this paper? Well, I have a new idea. That's me, right? Like I'm over, they're actually doing the real stuff. So that's hugely important. And so I think to me, everyone should have that conceptual model available and have a come to Jesus talk about where they fit on it, where they want to fit on it, and where they're best suited to fit on it. And I think the whole spectrum is legitimate. I know what I want to do with it, but certainly that's not the case. Not going to be the case for everyone,
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, I mean, also like you need almost. I feel like it's not like that I want per se to be doing something different or anything like that. But I do kind of like doing something that's a bit different, and for that to exist, you need people who are going down the more, how should we say, who are doing stuff that's more already accepted and where it's clearer where it's going.
I do think it is necessarily lonely though. Like you were saying, oh well, it's not necessarily who do you talk to about that sort of thing. Who do you talk to about like, well, I have the cognitive science of perspective taking, and then I have thick description. How do I marry the two? Who's the person that I like send an email? Who do I call up and talk to? I mean, there isn't. I mean, I don't know. And so yeah, it is lonely. Whereas like if I continue with
it seems like you're calling up Mark Granovetter.
Well, so that's that's been the most successful call that I've made so far, and I'm honestly not going to complain about that. That's why I was happy when that happened, because it's like this. It's a rare thing to get someone who is already on a similar page with that, and to have it be that guy. I mean, anyway, so but the point is that if I was working on Bayesian models of cognition, I mean, I could call up all my old mates from Boston, and we'd have a chat about it. So it's lonelier to do the thing, and that's a thing that works for me. A lot of my endeavors are lonely endeavors. Writing, for the most part, is a lonely endeavor. My podcast, it's nice to talk to people, but most of the work is done with me on my own. Most of my science projects so far have been all myself. So that's something that I'm working on is finding more collaborative opportunities, because I think I could benefit from a couple of them. But at the end of the day, my natural state is a little bit more solitary, I think. And I'm ready to, and also the traveling thing. You'll hear in my podcast the majority of that travel stuff is solitary travel, and that to me is the most meaningful, at least for the goals of doing something like a podcast. And so yeah, these solitary endeavors, because look, at the end of the day, for ideas, the moment you are a part of a group, that group is influencing the way you think about things. And to me, in my reading of the way the world works, if you want to really get at some truly unique ideas, it takes a lot of time spent alone, and you have to forfeit some of the group dynamics, and that sucks for a lot of reasons. It it's a lot more fun to be a part of a group, and it can be really difficult to be alone on something sometimes. And I think that's the kind of thing that you should look at, and people generally should look at and be like, well, how do I want to negotiate that? How do I want to deal with that trade-off, and be realistic about it? And rather than idealistic about, oh, it sounds great to want to do, whatever. I do think that there's, realistic considerations about the trade-offs involved in different strategies for career advancement and developing a sort of train of thought or something.
Yeah. To some extent, something that I've noticed is that I think I almost don't really want to be part of a group. I mean, this is just something I've noticed quite a lot. Like, I've never really, I feel like, I mean, maybe everyone feels this, I don't know. But I've never really been part of one group. I've always kind of been part of a few groups, even socially. I think, for example, in school, I think I was usually 3/4 part of that group, half part of that group. And I think everyone else probably assumed I was part of the other groups. And it's kind of interesting to me to see how in science this seems to be the same thing. Almost as soon as there is a group and I feel like I'm part of it, I start to move away from it. So I wonder how much of that is just coincidence or some sort of nonsensical introspection or something.
Oh, but it is. I think it's totally
something I've noticed.
No, I think you're definitely onto something there. I'm the same way as you described.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else you want to touch on?
I'm not sure. There's 2-3 things I'd like to mention once we're finished. Just because these are not things I want to make public right now. But theirs should be a lot shorter. These are more like individual questions. Other than that, I feel like we need to end on a slightly more upbeat note, rather than us two saying, "Oh yeah, it's lonely."
Oh, it's lonely being me.
And then I just stop the podcast.
Gosh, it's really difficult at being me. It's just there's exactly. You think that life is good, but no, mine is so difficult. Yeah, that's.
And stop.
Oh.
Especially, I'm not sure I'll have you have at the end. You discuss the podcast. I'm not sure I'll do that, so I might just literally just end it right there.